Well, as we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and as I thought about what Solomon is saying in this chapter, it's interesting how almost everything he says here revolves around other people. They almost all revolve around other people and how those that he was looking at interacted with those around them. And as I thought about other people this week, I thought, we're constantly surrounded by other people. Always. We're always surrounded by other people. We can't go anywhere or do anything, hardly, without people around us. Whether we go to the store, whether we stay home, whether we're in the community, whether we're at a hospital, wherever we are, we're constantly surrounded by other people, and we are constantly interacting with other people. We're constantly affected by those around us. The decisions that other people make affect us all the time. Sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in big ways. The decisions that we make on a daily basis are constantly affecting those around us. Just think about it for a minute. You're driving down the road getting to church this morning. Your decisions driving here were affected by those that you met on the road. How you reacted, how you drove. Everything was affected by other people and their decisions, and them by your decisions. So other people are an important part of our lives. Sometimes other people irritate us, and sometimes we probably irritate other people. Not me, but some people probably do. But no, sometimes people irritate us, sometimes people encourage us. And sometimes we run into somebody and think, man, I wish I hadn't seen them. Sometimes we run into somebody and we walk away thinking, man, that was such a good thing. I'm so glad I bumped into them. And I'm so encouraged that we had a few minutes to, interact. Sometimes we just want to be alone. Sometimes we don't want to be around other people. And sometimes we do. It depends on our mood. It depends on what's going on in our lives. As I thought about other people this week, I thought, God really did not create people to be alone. God didn't create people to be alone. We just finished a series on marriage and family, and we said that, God had created Adam, and Adam named all of the other animals and things that God had created, and then God said to Adam, it's not good for you to be alone. You need somebody else. And he created Eve and Adam's wife. But I thought, even outside of the marriage relationship, we need other people. If you go through the Old Testament and you read what took place there, God's people would come together, and then what would happen? They would fight, or there would be a sin, or something major would happen, and they would break off into different groups. And then they would go their separate ways for a period of time. And then all of a sudden, it was like, hey, we need each other. And they would come back together and realize how important each other was to them and to their success and to their godliness, ultimately. You get into the New Testament. In the New Testament, we see the same thing. People working together goes hand in hand with what God is doing in our world today. Paul says, and others say in the New Testament, that the church, believers, need each other. And we work together the way the body, the physical body works. And so again, the emphasis throughout the New Testament, again, is we need each other. And we need other people in our lives. I was thinking that in regards to Christ. And I'm getting ahead of myself, I think, because I don't see what I'm saying in my notes. So I'll just say it and we'll come back to it later. But I was thinking that in regards to Christ. Christ he never took advantage of anybody. He cooperated. He worked with those that were around him. And even though Christ was God and the Son of God, he came and he worked with other people to accomplish the work that he wanted to do in our world. So we need other people. Solomon, as I said earlier, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, began to look around. And as he looked around, he took note of what he saw. He took note of what he saw going on in the world. Up until then, and even including that, Solomon has been considering what is the purpose and meaning of our lives. Why do we live? Why are we alive? What is my life all about? And Solomon concluded that if our life is about wisdom and knowledge, or pleasure and drunkenness, or accomplishments and belongings, then our life is empty. If all our life is about is gaining and having things, then it's empty. It's like chasing after the wind. It's vanity. Because we may gather all of those things, but as he said in chapter 3, someday we're going to die just like the beasts of the field. What good are our things at that point? What value have they added to our lives? Solomon said, yeah, if my purpose in life is about wisdom and knowledge, and he said, man, I pursued all of that, more than anybody ever had. If that's all life is about, it's empty. And so he's looking at life, and he's seeing all that is around him, and he's trying to come up with a conclusion as to what life is all about. In chapter 4, as he looks around, he sees things, and all of the things that he sees here are in regards to other people. They're in regards to other people. And as I thought about what Solomon is saying in chapter 4, I thought he's really giving us a lesson on how important other people are in our lives. And how important other people need to be in our lives. Notice the first thing that he sees in the first couple of verses. He says, I saw the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of those that were oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power. And there was no one to comfort them. The first thing I believe that I gather from Ecclesiastes chapter 4 is that Solomon is saying about other people, they are not to be used. They were not to be taken advantage of. He's looking at oppression. He says, I look under the sun. And I think what he's saying here is I'm looking in the world. I'm looking out into the world that I live in, and what I see is people using other people. I see people taking advantage of other people. I see them being oppressed. When I think of oppression, I think of people being used. I think of people being put down or taken advantage of. And I think of people being used or taken advantage of for somebody else's benefit. And so when I see Solomon looking into the world and saying, what I see is oppression. I see people being pushed down. I see them being used. I see them being taken advantage of for the benefit of those that are taking advantage of them. In other words, there are those that are getting ahead in life, but they're getting ahead in life because of their oppression, their abuse, or their using of other people. Some people believe here that Solomon is looking into the court of law. He's looking at the legal system. And he's seeing those in power taking advantage of those that are powerless. And as they're taking advantage of those that are powerless, they're doing it to lift up themselves. They're using it in many ways to benefit themselves. And so he sees oppression. He sees people being used and taken advantage of. And those that are being oppressed, he describes in a couple of ways. He says, first of all, that they're hurting. He talks about the tears of the oppressed. And they're full of tears. They're being used. They're being taken advantage of. They're also uncomforted. He says there's nobody to come alongside them. There are those that have power. And he said they're oppressing those that are powerless. And there's nobody that can come alongside of them. There's nobody that can help lift them up. There's nothing that they can physically do about it. And then I guess I already said this, but he says they're helpless. They can't do anything. They're uncomforted. There's nobody to help them, nobody to comfort them. Now, as I thought about that this week in Solomon's day, I was thinking about that in our day. Are people taken advantage of today? I mean, are people oppressed today so that others can get ahead? So that others can benefit? So that others can seemingly, and seemingly being the key word, have more value and purpose in their lives? I think so. I thought about it in several different ways. How about in government? How about in government? And I try not to have political messages, and I'm not having one this morning. But do we see in government those that have power and those that have authority? Do we see at times they're taking advantage of those that don't have the same power and don't have the same authority to benefit themselves, to give them more power and to give them more authority? I think we see that all the time. And I've heard it justified by people saying, well, that's just politics. That's just how it works. Well, it may be, but that doesn't make it right. And that Solomon is saying people are not to be used. They're not to be taken advantage of for your own benefit. How about in churches? I mean, do we see churches today that oppress and use and take advantage of people to benefit their church or to lift themselves up and to make themselves feel better? Absolutely we do. I mean, I've been in churches and heard something maybe not exactly like this, but this was at least how I understood it. You know, if you want your family members to go to heaven, then you need to donate. And you need to give, and you need to make donations to the church in some way. What is that? That's oppression. That's using people. That's taking advantage of people. I know people that have built their entire church on finding little picayune things that are wrong with other churches. And then making big deals so they can lift themselves up. What are they doing? They're oppressing. They're using, they're taking advantage of other people, and we dare never do that in the church. And yet it happens. How about in communities or in families? I think we can look at every organization. We can look at every organization around us. And there are those that take advantage of other people to get themselves ahead, to benefit in some way. It was interesting to me, and I mentioned this last week in our Bible study. It's interesting to me that Solomon is seeing this. And that Solomon is saying there's nobody to help them. Nobody to come alongside of them. And I said last Sunday, and I've thought more about it since I asked the question last week, but I thought, you know, why isn't Solomon coming alongside of them? Solomon is the king. Solomon perhaps was the most powerful man in the world at that day. And why isn't Solomon stepping into his own court system and saying, wait, stop? Why isn't Solomon standing on their behalf? As I thought about it more this week, I thought, you know, perhaps he did. And perhaps it was so overwhelming that he just kind of threw up his hands and gave up. Because, you know, it would be very easy for Solomon to step in and say, okay, you need to get out of here. You're oppressing, you're using people. I'm going to put somebody else in your place. And then all of a sudden they're doing the same thing. And maybe Solomon dealt with that, and it happened again and again and again. And perhaps now Solomon is saying, man, it's no use. What's going on here? People are taking advantage. They're using other people. So perhaps Solomon did try to help. And perhaps it was so overwhelming that he couldn't do anything about it. It just continued. It's interesting the conclusions that Solomon makes here. And I really struggled with these. And you know, if you were here last Sunday, we talked about this, because Solomon's conclusions are interesting and sad. Solomon says, and I thought the dead who were already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. Solomon says, you know, as I looked at the oppression, I thought, you know, it's better for those that have died already. Because they're not at least seeing the oppression that is taking place. That's a strong conclusion. And he makes a stronger one. Because the next verse he says, better yet are those that were never born. Because at least they never saw the oppression that I see. Solomon is broken. He's devastated at the oppression that he sees around him. As I mentioned earlier, as I thought about that, I began to think about Jesus in the New Testament. And I thought, you know, you never see Jesus using somebody or taking advantage of somebody to accomplish his mission, to accomplish his purpose. You never see that. He used people in the sense that he brought them in and taught them and trained them and sent them out. But he didn't use them. He didn't oppress them. He didn't take advantage of them. I thought, you know, on the other hand, in Philippians chapter 4, Paul uses Jesus as a great example of what our attitude needs to be. Because in Philippians chapter 4, he said, well, I got ahead of myself here. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul said, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only on his own interest, but on the interest of others. And then he goes ahead and he says, do what Jesus did. He put other people ahead of himself. And so Solomon looks at the world in Ecclesiastes and he says, don't look at other people as pawns to be used. Don't look at other people as simply those that you can take advantage of to benefit yourself, to find more power and more meaning and more significance in your own life. People aren't to be used. They're not to be taken advantage of. He goes on in verse 4, and he makes another statement of what he saw. He says, "Then I saw all the toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and is striving after the wind." Solomon then looks around and he says, I see oppression. But he began to look at those that were working and those that were laboring. And he says, what are they working for? What are they laboring for? And he says, what I see? Most people are laboring simply to keep up with their neighbors. Simply because they envy those around them. And as I thought about what Solomon said, I thought, we need to be careful that we don't look at other people as pawns to be used. We also need to be careful that we don't look at people around us as competitors. As competitors. He says, I see all of these people and they're working all kinds of hours. They're working day and night and they're laboring. And their motive is simply to keep up with their neighbor. Simply not to get behind. What are they doing? They're competing. They're competing with one another. We see that today. Talked about it last Sunday morning and last Sunday night in our Bible study. Absolutely. Absolutely. People can't let the neighbor get ahead. They got to make sure we have the nicest things, because what do people think of us? If I don't, drive the nicest car and have the nicest lawn and have the nicest things, what do people think of me? I got to work hard so that I can keep up, so that I don't get behind. He says, sometimes we look at our neighbors as competitors, and we just simply want to stay ahead of them. As I thought about that this week, I thought, there's some negative effects to that. There's some negative effects to that. One of the negative effects is we look down on the success of other people. How does it make us feel when those around us are successful, more so than we are? How do we look at that? What do we think about that? If I see somebody that I know being successful, does that bother me? Am I envious? Am I jealous of their success? Or can I walk up and congratulate them? Say, man, I'm so happy that you're successful. That's wonderful. Or do I look at it as competitive? Okay, if he's that successful, I need to push ahead. I need to be better. I need to keep up with him. If we're simply striving to keep up, then we look down on the success of others. Another thing that I was thinking about is it takes away our contentment. One of the greatest blessings of the Christian life is contentment. I don't think there's anything greater than just being able to be content. Knowing that God has promised to meet my needs. Knowing that God will never leave me and never forsake me. Knowing that whatever happens in life, God is there. And I don't need to have a lot. All I need is my needs being met. And with that, I'm happy. I'm content. If we're constantly striving with other people, we're not content. And if we're not content, we're miserable. Because we never are content. We never have enough. And so he looks at other people and he says, don't look at them as competitors. Don't work hard simply to try to keep up with them. Don't be motivated by envy. He says a couple of things here, and I just find them interesting in verses 5 and 6. He talks about the one in verse 4 that is just constantly striving and toiling and working to keep up. And then he shares the opposite of that in verse 5. He says, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. The opposite of the one that's working and trying to keep up is the one that just sits back, folds his hands, and some of the versions say starves to death. Because he's not willing to work for anything. He's not motivated by any reason. All he wants to do is sit back and have somebody else take care of him. Have somebody else meet his needs. And so, one of the opposites of working and striving is to sit back and say, and this is what I thought of when I read that verse, that's not fair. That guy has everything, and I have nothing. I'm just going to sit here because he owes it to me. He needs to take care of me. And it says that man is a fool. It says that he sits back, he does nothing, and he eats his own flesh. He starves to death. That's Solomon's conclusion. And so we've got the one that's competing with his neighbor. We've got the man that sits back and does nothing and is not willing to work. And then the next verse is the balance of the two. He says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toiling and striving after the wind. You know what I think Solomon is saying there? Neither one of those is good. It's not good to constantly be competing with your neighbor and working so hard that you don't have time for anything else. But it's also not good to sit back and fold your hands and do nothing. He said it's better to have balance. And he says 2 hands full of toil and striving after the wind is bad. It's not a good thing. 2 hands full of just work, work, work. He says what you really need is 1 hand with quietness. And the other hand needs to be striving and working. A fellow I was listening to, and I forgot his name, but a fellow I was listening to here a couple weeks ago talking about these verses said that his dad had a tattoo on both hands. And I don't think I wrote this down, so I hope I get it right. He said one fist had the words, or the letters W-O-R-K across it, work. And the other one, and I'll get the point, but I may get the wrong words. The other one said rest, or play, but I think it said rest. And so he said, my dad had on his hand 1 work and 1 play or rest. And he said that's the balance that we need in our lives. We need to work. God called us to work. God created us to work. But we can't get so out of balance with the work that we forget to take time to rest. And that we forget to, as Solomon said last week, and he'll say again next week, enjoy what God has given us. So often we're so busy working and striving that we never take the time to sit back and enjoy what God has given us. And it's interesting to me how many times through the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is going to say, eat, drink, be merry, enjoy the gift that God has given you. And so often we're so out of balance in our lives that we don't enjoy what God has given us. So Solomon here looks at other people, and he says other people aren't to be used. They're not to be taken advantage of. And then he says other people are not competitors. We need to be careful that we don't look at those around us and just say, hey, I need to compete with them. And they're just simply competitors. And then the third thing that he says, beginning in verse 7, he says, I saw again. He says, again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all of his toil. And his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. The third group of people that Solomon looks at are those that don't need anybody else. They don't need anybody else. He says they have no brother, they have no father, they have nobody but themselves to work for. And he said the thing is they're working, and they're working, and they're working, and all they're working for is themselves. They're just trying to get themselves ahead. They don't need it. They don't need any more. They just constantly are working, constantly trying to get more for themselves. They have nobody to share it with. They're not taking care of anybody else. And Solomon concluded that that also is vanity. And he says, an unhappy business. And I thought, we need to be careful that we don't use other people. We need to be careful that we're not constantly competing in a negative sense with other people. And we also need to be careful that we don't at some point get to the place of saying, I don't need other people. I don't need anybody else. I'm going to take care of myself. Solomon says that's not good either. That's vanity. That's chasing after the wind. Finally, he goes on in verse 9 and he begins to share the benefits of other people. The first 3 things he says, I saw, I saw, I saw. Now he begins in verse 9. He doesn't say I saw. Now he's stating fact. Now he's going to share this is what is necessary. This is what is true. And so he begins by saying that other people are necessary in our lives. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. Other people are necessary. And no matter who we are, we need other people. We need other people in our lives. In verse 9, he says that friendships are a good investment. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. Good reward here has the idea of a good return, has the idea of an investment. As I was reading some of the commentators this week, one of them said that the best investment that we can make in our lives is in relationships with other people. The best investment that we can make in our lives is other people. Time spent with other people. Building, strengthening, enhancing relationships with other people. As I thought about that, I thought, we need to get out of our minds today that our lives are fulfilled by accomplishing things. We need to get out of our mind today that our lives are fulfilled by the accomplishments that we make. And we need to get into our minds the importance of investing in our relationship with other people. We need to be willing to invest time and energy in building relationships with those around us. Solomon here shares the benefit of that. He shares the benefit of that, and he says, and we're just going to hit them briefly, but the benefits are several. In verse 10, those that we have relationships with pick us up when we fall down. They pick us up. He says in verse 10, for if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. A good friend is somebody that will pick us up when we fall down. If we are a good friend, we will pick up those that we are friends with when they fall down. There's a benefit to having friends. They pick us up. Again, I was reading the commentator this week, and they said this. They said, how do you tell a real friend? How do you tell a real friend? He says, just get in trouble. The people that are still around you are your real friends. There may not be as many left as you thought. He said a friend is the kind of person you can call at 2 o'clock in the morning and tell them that you need them. And they don't ask, so what's the problem, and then decide whether or not to come. They simply ask, where are you? As they're getting dressed and headed for the door. He said, that's a friend. A friend is somebody that lifts us up when we fall down. A friend that helps us when we are in need. And that's the next one, verse 11. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? The idea here is one that's meeting needs. Keeping warm is something that we need. And I don't think he's talking necessarily just here about cuddling up and staying warm on a cold night. I believe what he's saying is a real friend is somebody that helps meet our needs. Somebody that will do what they can to meet a need that we have. Who do we turn to when we have a need? Somebody that we're close to. Somebody that we have a friendship with. Somebody that we have a good relationship with. A good friend helps us in our time of need. Verse 12. A good friend gives us strength to stand when we need that strength. He says, though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. A friend is somebody that will help us to stand. The idea here is of two people going into battle. And when they went to battle, they stand back to back. And battle in Solomon's day wasn't, push buttons and send missiles or fly drones. Battle was hand-to-hand combat. And he says, a friend is somebody that you go into battle with that'll stand at your back and fight that way while you fight this way. Somebody that will help you to stand and help you to be successful. And a true friend today is somebody that will stand with us in the battles of our lives and give us the strength that we need to help carry on in those battles. And we will do the same for them because we see and understand the importance of investing in relationships. Solomon looks at other people and he sees people being used. He sees people taken advantage of. He sees people that are competing with their neighbors simply to have more. He sees those that don't have anybody. They haven't invested in relationships with other people. And Solomon concludes in every case that it's vanity. It's striving after the wind. It's painful business. He concludes that we need other people in our lives. He concludes that the greatest investment that we can make is in the relationships with the people that are around us. As I thought about that this week, I thought, how do you and I look at other people in our lives? How do we look at other people in our lives? I mean, do we focus on our own needs, our own wants, our own desires? Or do we focus on the needs and the wants and the desires of people around us? How do we invest in the lives of those around us? As I'm thinking about that, if we were to ask the question, how do you invest in those around you? If you can't answer that question, probably it's because we're not investing. We're not investing in our relationships with other people. We're not making those a priority in our own lives. We need to invest in other people. We need to look at other people and see how important they are to us and how important we need to be in their lives. How do we value those around us? How much effort are we putting into the lives of other people? According to Solomon, that's important. And according to Solomon, anything else is vanity. Anything else is chasing after the wind. Let's take a moment and pray. Father, I thank you this morning for your word. And again, another challenging chapter in Ecclesiastes, and yet an important chapter. As Solomon thinks about other people and how they're used and taken advantage of and competed with. How those that are doing that lack contentment in their own lives. I pray, Lord, that we would look in our hearts and in our lives. I pray that, Lord, where we fall short in these things, that you would convict us. Lord, I pray that where we succeed, that you would encourage us. But Lord, help us to look and to consider what Paul said in Philippians 2. When he said each person needs to put others ahead of himself. Lord, I pray that we would see that in our own lives. And if we are falling short, I pray, Lord, that we would repent of that and turn away from it. And that we would begin striving not to compete with, but to benefit and to build relationships with people around us. And Lord, Solomon is clear that the benefit to all of us is great. I pray, Lord, that we might see that in our lives. We thank you.